our invited speakers, participants, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to be your MC for today. I am Amrit Kaur, Anak Perempuan Bajan Singh, representing our organizers, Center for Pre-University Studies and Center for Education and Language, MAHSA University. Welcome to MAHSA International Conference on Education, Language and Literature 2021, MISEL. Dear all, let's begin our conference with his blessing by saying grace. I would like to invite Mr. Muhammad Badrul Adzam to lead the prayer recitation.
Fatiha. A'udzu billahi minasyaitonir rajim. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Wassalatu wassalamu ala asyrafil mursalin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Allahumma innaka qallahu azim, innaka sami'un alim, innaka afurur rahim, innaka rabbul arsyir azim, innaka barrul jawadul karim. Ya Allah, Ya Alim, Ya Hakim. In conjunction with the MAHSA International Conference this morning, we pray to you, Ya Allah, that this conference receive blessing, taufiq, hidayah and inayah from you, from the beginning to the end. Ya Allah, Ya Fattah, Ya Halim, please bring us out of the darkness of doubt and favor us with the light of comprehension. Open to us the door of your mercy and unfold for us the treasure of your knowledge by your mercy. Ya Allah, make our tongue full of remembrance and our heart we owe of you by your mercy, the most merciful of the merciful one. Allahumma aftah alayna hikmataka wa inshur alayna min khazaini rahmatika ya arhamar rahimin. Allahumma inna nas'aluka salamatan fid din wa afiyatan fi jasadin wa ziyadatan fi ilmih wa barakatan fi rizqih wa tabatan hablal maut wa rahmatan 'indal maut wa maghfiratan ba'dal maut. Allahumma hawin alayna fi sakaratil maut wa najanata minan nar wa hawa'idil hisab. Rabbana la tuzigh qulubana ba'da idh hadaytana wa hab lana min ladunka rahmah innaka antal wahhab. Rabbana atina fid dunya hasanah wa fil akhirati hasanah wa qina azaban nar. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Walhamdulillahi rabbil alamin.
Thank you, Mr. Badrul. On behalf of the Committee of MAHSA International Conference on Education, Language and Literature 2021, MISEL, I would like to thank everyone who is watching live through YouTube and Facebook. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, let us proceed with a welcoming speech. I would like to invite Madam Masita Mat, the Assistant Director of Center for Pre-U Studies, MAHSA University, for her speech.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and a very good morning, everyone. Honorary Veteran, Professor Tan Sri Dr. Haji Muhammad Hanifah bin Haji Abdullah, Executive Chairman, MAHSA Group, Chief Patron, Dr. Sharil bin Professor Tan Sri Dr. Haji Muhammad Hanifah, Group Managing Director, MAHSA Group, Professor Dr. Ikram Shah bin Ismail, Vice Chancellor, MAHSA University, Professor Dr. Sri Kumar Chakravarti, Director of Research, Innovation and Enterprise, MAHSA University, Keynote Speaker, Mr. Henry Kogi, Assistant Professor, University of Nottingham, United Kingdom, Plenary Speaker, Dr. Ramesh Nair, Associate Professor, Academy of Language Studies, University Technology Mara UiTM Malaysia, President, Malaysian English Language Teaching Association, Malta, Mr. David Booth, Director, Test Development, English Assessment, Pearson, United Kingdom, our guest speaker, Dr. Chatur Setyawargo, Early Childhood Expert, Curriculum Consultant Advisor. Honorable guests, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Committee of MAHSA International Conference on Education, Language and Literature, MISEL 2021, I am very pleased to welcome everyone to join this virtual conference. I wish to convey my sincere appreciation, particularly to the advisor, Associate Professor Dr. Cynthia Yolanda Dos, co-chairs Dr. Chil Wei Yun and Ms. Aimi Farina Sarif, as well as to the conference committee for organizing this event that happened today. We're also very fortunate to have the support from the university as well as MAHSA Academy throughout the preparation period. I would also like to thank all the distinguished panels and moderators for taking their time to participate from near and far in today's conference. We never expected the spread of COVID-19 pandemic previous year has impacted and disrupted every aspect of our life, which result in everyone become more familiar with digital technologies. The virus has resulted in schools shut all across the world. Globally, over 1.2 billion children are out from the classroom. As a result, education has changed dramatically, with the distinctive rise of e-learning, whereby teaching is undertaken remotely and on digital platforms. For teaching and learning, pedagogical responses and strategies are emerging due to the implementation of technologies. Improve pedagogy enables the students to get a high understanding of the subjects and helps them in applying those learnings in their daily lives, mostly outside of the classroom. Having a well-taught lessons that constructive, collaborative, integrative, reflective, as well as inquiry-based really can improve the quality of teaching and the way students learn, helping them to gain a deeper grasp of fundamental materials. While some believe that the unplanned and rapid move to online learning with no training, insufficient bandwidth, and little preparation might be result in a poor user experience that is inconducive. Others also believe that there is a new hybrid model of education with significant benefits. There are, however, challenges to overcome. Whatever it is, this is the future of learning. Nevertheless, the effectiveness of technologies in education varies amongst all age groups. The general consensus on children, especially younger ones, in that the structured environment is required because the kids are easily disrupted. To get the full benefits of online learning, there needs to be concerted effort to provide this structure and go beyond the traditional classroom method. With the theme, Evolving Pedagogies and Practices in Teaching Learning, we do hope in this given platform we can hear the ideas and professional growth and thoughts due to the rapid development of teaching and learning. With that, I wish all of you a fruitful discussion today. With that, thank you.
Thank you, Madam Masjida, for the warm welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, next I would like to invite Professor Dr. Sri Kumar Chakravarti, Director, Postgraduate Studies, Research and Innovation of MAHSA University for the opening speech.
Thank you, Ms. Amrit Kaur, and thank you, members of the organizing committee, and Dr. Vice Chancellor, and all the members in the team, including Max and Macom. Welcome to MISAL, and I hope you all have a wonderful time. We have a lot of delegates, and I hope that you get a fantastic experience on learning various aspects of pedagogy, assessment, curriculum, which are all various skills that are set for today's event. As much as we have many speakers who are going to talk about all this, I am here just to tell you a small story from ancient India about 5,000 years ago. About this small boy in a hunter family in a tribe in India, and this boy's name was Eklavya. And this boy wanted to learn the skills of archery from the greatest guru at that time, that was Guru Drona, who trained all the top princes in archery. And his favorite student was this boy called Arjuna. These are Indian names, but just bear with me. And this is from the magnum epic Mahabharata. So the Guru Drona wanted to teach Arjuna in such a way that Arjuna would be the best archer in the world. But Eklavya wanted to learn archery from the same Guru. And the Guru refused to teach this boy because the Guru trains only princes and he is a royal Guru. So Arjuna went on to become the best archer in the world. But a few years later, when all of them were hunting in the jungle, they found this boy who was actually shooting arrows all over and with fantastic archery skills that even surpassed the talent of Arjuna. So Drona asked him, "Who are you?" This boy said, "I am Eklavya." And Drona asked him, "Where did you learn this archery?" He said, "I learned it from my guru Drona." But Drona said, "I haven't ever seen you." This boy said, "I have seen you training Arjuna, and from a distance I made a statue of you, and seeing you as an inspiration, I learned archery on my own. And trust me, this boy was a better archer than Arjuna." Now, Drona, being a typical teacher who wants his student to be the best student in the world, was worried that one day Eklavya would be stronger than Arjuna. So he told Eklavya, "Well, you say that I am your guru. I need some fees from you." Eklavya said, "Sure, what do you want?" He said, "I want your thumb. Cut it off and give me." And everybody knew that if he cuts his thumb, he cannot be a good archer anymore. But to satisfy his guru, he cut it and gave his thumb to Drona. But in the story goes on that he still continued to be a great archer. Now, why am I telling this story to you here now? The Guru Drona is the typical guru or teacher or professor that we see in every university who wants to instill the best in his student and who is so possessive about his own student that he does not want any other students to be better than his students. That is the loyalty and dedication that every teacher has in his profession, which sometimes is quite dangerous, because you become very possessive about your students. His disciple Arjuna was the best example of a student who is taught in a curriculum where we use pedagogic teaching, where the learner is dependent on the teacher. The learner does not have life experiences. He comes to the teacher blank, and the teacher influences him. He evaluates him. He gives assessment. He gives him a curriculum to go through, and the student advances step by step. So learning is by the guru, the instructor, is sequenced in a logical way. You go through examinations and you pass. But everybody talks about pedagogy, nobody talks about andragogy. In all educational books, if you go through, very few people talk about andragogy. And the best example of andragogy is Eklavya, where the learner is self-dependent. This is what we have now as self-directed learning. NQA says that we need to have self-directed learning, problem-based learning, critical thinking. This is where the student evaluates himself. He doesn't have a guru straight away. It is either online learning or distant learning or self-directed learning. And the student takes responsibility for the process. The student uses life experiences. Usually this is seen as adult learners. So adults learn from instructors, but also from one another, like group discussions and all that. So as much as we all talk about pedagogy, nobody talks about andragogy. But we need both pedagogy and andragogy in the curriculum. And this is something that should be instilled in all curricula world over, and which is being done after COVID, because many of us are self-directed learners after the onset of COVID. Now, Malaysian students have 3 experiences by the time they reach their late teens or early adulthood. The first experience is getting treated by a doctor. Second experience is being taught by a teacher. Third experience is learning to drive a car by the time they are 20, 21. Now, a student who is treated by a doctor usually gets treated by a doctor who's got 5 years of studying experience plus 2 or 3 years of housemanship and so on. You're treated by a professional. When you're taught driving, you have to pass an exam. Then for 2 years, you have to drive a car with a P sticker, and only then you are sent to the road to drive, because only then you are seen as an experienced driver. Right? All you students out there would agree. So when for a doctor and for a driver, they make sure that you are instructed by a person, and with 2 years experience, only then you're let on a road. But when you attend a class under a teacher, how sure are you that a teacher has been trained to teach you? There are many universities where they see the CV. Oh, wow, you've done your PhD, you've got 10 research papers, you're a great researcher, you'll make a good teacher. So a teacher is decided based on your research experiences, or a teacher is based on, okay, you've done your master's and you have 3 years experience and you have 2 papers, you come. Do they take you through a structured way in which you have to teach this way? You have to do a problem-based discussion. You have to form questions this way. You have to follow Bloom's taxonomy and so on. There are some universities that do that, but majority of the colleges and universities in the world don't. They just take you and they make you as a teacher go through experiences yourself, stumble and fall and make mistakes, and then become a teacher. All the good teachers you see now are those who made mistakes over 10 or 20 years. We have very few teachers who have gone through perfect teaching training systems, and that is what we need. And we hope that in this workshop today, we instill into you students and you teachers about all the latest methods in pedagogy, andragogy, and even curriculum review, curriculum assessment, and how to structure an entire curriculum for students. So I'm glad that we have many local and international participants here, and I hope you guys have a wonderful time today. And I also look forward to joining in for the sessions and learning from all of you. For each of us, learning is an experience. The age doesn't matter. What I'm going to learn today from you all is an example of andragogy again. Thank you very much and have a nice day.
Thank you, Professor Dr. Sri Kumar. It was a great analogy. I personally believe that the true meaning of teaching comes with a great teacher's experience of teaching and learning. And andragogy is serving to be more important than pedagogy along the way. Thank you once again. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, we proceed by welcoming the Vice Chancellor of MAHSA University, Professor Datuk Dr. Ikram Shah bin Ismail, to deliver his speech and inaugurate this conference. Please welcome. I think there is a delay. Okay, there is some time that we have to kill. Okay, so let's just be patient. Let's just be patient.
I hope you all can hear me once again.
Yes.
And as Dato VC is not in yet, I would like to welcome all the participants once again on behalf of Dato Vice Chancellor. And Dato Vice Chancellor sends his regards and his best wishes for this conference and event to be a successful event. And at the same time, on behalf of Vice Chancellor, I would like to share another analogy to ensure that the event goes well. Again, this is about teachers and students. There was this teacher who gave a group work to her class of small children. And she said, I want you all to draw something that comes first in your mind. And all these students, each student drew something else. And there was this one student who actually drew a hand. And the teacher took the hand, a boy. The teacher took the hand drawing and asked the students, other students, what do you interpret? And different students interpreted that it was a hand of a farmer. Farmers raised turkeys. One suggested it's a police officer. because the police protect and care for people. Some guess it was the hand of God and God feeds us. The discussion went on. What the teacher was doing is self directed learning and critical learning, which is what every teacher has to do. But at the end, the teacher did something else. She paused at the boy's desk and asked him whose hand it was. And the boy said, "Teacher, this is your hand." And then the teacher recalled the times that she had taken his hand and walked with him here and there. She had said, "Take my hand, we'll go outside. Take my hand, I'll show you how to hold your pencil. Let's do this together." So the boy was thankful for the teacher's hand. Now, the reason why I quote this, again on behalf of the other Vice Chancellor, is this story speaks of more than thankfulness. This story tells us how the teacher handles the students, and at the same time, it also tells us about how students look upon teachers. It says about teachers teaching and parents parenting and friends showing friendship, and how much it means to all boys like this boy in the world. Now, they may not always say thanks. Our students will not always say thanks to us, but they will remember that hand that reaches out to you. So, you all, as teachers, all participants today are teachers or teacher trainers or students who are trained to be teachers. Remember that every student now would be grateful to you tomorrow in life. And make sure that we mentor students and we are thankful to those who taught us as well. So, on behalf of the Vice Chancellor, I would once again like to welcome you all for today's event. And we hope that the event is a grand success, and all the outcomes of the various talks are very fruitful. Thank you, and we look forward for Dato VC to join in again if he is in here.
Thank you, Prof. Sri. I believe as an educator that teachers' presence means a lot for students, right? And when they do things like that, they don't say thank you easily. But over the years, what comes is the appreciation. Appreciation goes a long way, okay? And still, we are able to, as educators, we are able to pick up and keep moving forward, because we have this passion, to educate and to make sure that we serve to the community, right? So just like Prof. Sri addressed educators just now, okay, as teachers, we have a great role in educating the younger generation, even all the generation, okay? It depends on the level that you are at, okay? But what I have to say is, like I said, gratitude is really important, and teaching is meaningful. That is what my experience as an educator speaks for. Okay, so let us all be prepared for our next session. Okay, so distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, we proceed by welcoming the Vice Chancellor of MAHSA University, Professor Dr. Ikram Shah bin Ismail, to deliver his speech and inaugurate this conference. Please welcome.
Thank you, Amrit. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And a warm thank you to Prof. Sri Kumar for his opening speech. I'm delighted to be in the presence of well-known individuals amongst us today. We have with us today Associate Professor Dr. Ramesh Nai, Academy of Language Studies, UITM Malaysia, and President of Malaysian English Language Teaching Association, Assistant Professor Dr. Henry Kogi, Educational Leadership, University of Nottingham, UK, Dr. Chatur Sityowargo, Early Childhood Expert from Indonesia, and Mr. David Booth, Director, Test Development and English Assessment, Pearson, United Kingdom. And also present with us today from MAHSA, Professor Sri Kumar, and Madam Masita, the Assistant Director for Center for Pre-U Studies, MAHSA University. And not forgetting organizers from both Center for Education and Language, Center for Pre-U Studies, and MAHSA staff. Very good morning to all of you. We are here today to keep one's ears open on the symposium that will be discussed by different plenary and keynote speakers in relation to a variety of tracks based on the evolving pedagogies and practices in teaching and learning itself. It's a pleasant occasion for all of us, and I am glad to be part of this wonderful conference. Ladies and gentlemen, the International Conference is dedicated to bringing together a significant number of diverse scholarly events for presentation within the conference program. With its high quality, it provides an exceptional value for students, academics, and industry researchers. International Conference on Education, Language and Literature aims to bring together leading academic educators, researchers, and research scholars to exchange and share their experiences and research results on all aspects of education, curriculum, assessment, evaluation, pedagogy, early childhood education, and technology in teaching and learning. It also provides a premier interdisciplinary platform for researchers, practitioners, and educators to present and discuss the most recent innovations, trends, and concerns, as well as practical challenges encountered and solutions adopted in the fields of education. The convergence of recent technologies, web and mobile technologies, provides unique opportunities and infrastructure for both face-to-face and online learning environments. However, specific environments for constructing knowledge are needed. In such environments, knowledge on media should bring together the technology and learning theories to form meaningful settings for learners with different academic, administrative, and support needs. MyCell 2021 aims to provide an environment for experts to discuss the current state-of-the-art facilities for learning in schools, industry, and universities. MAHSA University believes that this international conference is important to enable learning of the future to be defined through studied research. In this pursuit, the conference is believed to act as a platform to bridge the gap in knowledge dissemination, enhancing the true essence of learning. I would like to conclude with a strong hope that this conference will be beneficial to all, and that it will give all of us the chance to gather different insights and learn new trends in various fields. Thank you very much, and I appreciate your presence here and your joint efforts in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dato Ikram, for your meaningful speech, and thank you for officiating MAHSA International Conference on Education, Language and Literature 2021, MISEL. Ladies and gentlemen, before we begin, I would like to remind you that you can leave your questions in the comment box and we will address them in the Q&A session after the speech. It's an honor to invite our first plenary speaker for today, Associate Professor Dr. Ramesh Nair from Academy of Language Studies, University Technology Mara, Malaysia. He is also the President of the Malaysian English Language Teaching Association, MELTA. Please welcome.
Thank you so much, Amrit. Yang berbahagia Datuk Professor Dr. Ikram Shah, Vice Chancellor of MAHSA University, Professor Chakravarti, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. Thank you for joining me at this presentation this morning. I'd like to first thank MAHSA University for inviting me to speak at its inaugural International Conference on Education, Language and Literature. As the title of my presentation suggests, my focus is on English language education, an area that I have been involved in for over 30 years. As I have been teaching at university for 20 of those 30 years, I wish to locate my presentation in the area of English language education at higher learning institutions. I must, however, begin with a caveat. It is difficult to paint a picture of English language education with a broad brush, simply because there are differences in the teaching and learning of English from one higher learning institution to another. Universities design and offer courses independently, although they may be bound by some conditions set by the Malaysian Ministry of Higher Education or the Malaysian Qualifications Agency. I therefore speak on this topic based on my observations and experiences, which may be slightly different from yours. I'd like some help with the slides, please. So this is the title of my presentation. I reflect on English language education in Malaysia higher learning institutions and whether reforms are on the card. Next slide, please. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, as the theme of this conference suggests, education is evolutionary. Pedagogies and practices evolve to meet the demands of a changing society. The topics of discussion in education today are significantly different from the narratives of just 5 years ago. The career choices of today are no longer the same as those pursued a decade ago. Who would have thought, say a decade ago, that social media influencing, where individuals try to persuade and convince consumers' behavior through social media platforms, would be a career option? Next slide, please. Acknowledging this fact that pedagogies and practices must evolve to meet the demands of a changing society, an important question we must ask ourselves is how our classroom practices have changed to reflect evolution. I'm not talking here about the more visible surface level changes which have been forced upon us during this pandemic, such as the shift to online platforms rather than face-to-face lessons, although this is important. How have our approaches to English language teaching changed? Even when I began my career as a qualified teacher some 30 years ago, I think I was still drawing on my own experiences as a school student learning English from my own teachers. So regardless of what took place when I trained as a teacher, I think when I found myself in the classroom, I did find myself from time to time thinking about how my teachers delivered lessons to me. So even after 30 years, I find that I still need to unlearn the old ways of doing things. And it cannot be denied that change is difficult. Next slide, please. At a recent symposium I moderated earlier this month, I engaged with academics from several countries, and the conversation turned to the use of a child's native language in the English language classroom. And this is an example I wish to take about unlearning practices of the past. For many years, I strongly objected to students using their native language during my lessons, often threatening them with action. This was one of the fundamental lessons I received when I trained as a teacher, that the use of the L1 or mother tongue was the last option that an English language teacher should consider. While I stuck to my guns, research on L1 use in the English language classroom grew, and many researchers and classroom practitioners talked about the benefits of leveraging on a learner's mother tongue. And so, even after teaching for decades, I have had to unlearn. I now embrace the idea that an English language learner's mother tongue is a powerful tool which we should acknowledge and take advantage of. As non-native speakers of English, we are in a privileged position as English language teachers. We have the skill set and competence needed to facilitate mediation activities where a student uses his or her L1 to communicate in a target language. So I think the lesson here is that as we talk about evolving pedagogies, we cannot separate that from evolving practices as English language instructors in a language classroom. Next slide, please. The question I would like to pose in this presentation is one that would likely be answered differently depending on which higher learning institution you are attached to or how long you have been a teacher. Because as I said just now, our experiences as English language teachers in higher learning institutions really differ quite a bit depending on where we are attached to. How much change have you been able to observe in the teaching and learning of English at higher learning institutions? And that's the question I'd like all of us to reflect on. If you have been teaching English for a long time, like me, you may want to reflect on the changes you have experienced over the last decade or two. If you have not been teaching for that long, you may want to compare your practices with your experience of learning English when you were a university student yourself. For me personally, I would say that little has changed. The names of courses and the codes may have changed, but content remains pretty much the same. In conversations I've had with colleagues tasked with managing courses, it appears that making changes is difficult. Bureaucratic red tape is often cited as the reason for ensuring that changes are not too drastic. I've had conversations with resource persons of particular courses, and in those conversations, the resource person sometimes acknowledges that there are observable problems with the existing scheme of work. But then that is followed by another conversation where the resource person talks about the complications involved in imposing and making changes. And until that change is made, things remain the same, much to the detriment of the teaching and learning experience in the classroom. So it appears, therefore, that the ecosystem at higher learning institutions sometimes resist change, and this is a cause for concern. Next slide, please. When we receive new students, we are guided by a set of assumptions. You know that the students have been learning English for over a decade while at primary and secondary schools. Depending on the requirements set at your respective universities, you know that the students have attained a certain grade in their SPM or MWET English paper. So as teachers of English, we are tasked with helping students to improve their proficiency and meet the communication needs in the real world. However, this is where the problem begins to unravel. Next slide, please. For a long time now, we have read about issues related to the employability of our graduates and accusations that their poor proficiency in English is affecting performance at the workplace. The blame game then begins. Next slide, please. Universities lament that they have a short window of opportunity to help students hone their proficiency in English and that they receive students who are weak in the language, regardless of what is presented on their certificates. So the students may possess an A in SPM English, but teachers teaching English as well as lecturers of other subjects find that these students who have that A in English still struggle with the challenges of academic communication at university. Post-secondary teachers blame the secondary school teachers. The secondary school teachers blame the primary school teachers. And so the problem is evidently systemic, and there is a need for reform. Next slide, please. Following the release of the Malaysia Education Blueprint 2013-2025, a document that spells out the direction Malaysia plans to take to reform its education system, a second publication titled English Language Education Reform in Malaysia, the Roadmap 2015-2025, was released by the Ministry of Education Malaysia. The latter publication serves to guide significant reforms in English language education from preschool right up to university. Next slide, please. So I'd now like to reflect on the journey so far. The implementation of the new curriculum in Malaysian primary and secondary schools has involved major changes which have taken place over the last 5 years and will have implications for higher learning institutions in Malaysia as early as next year. The question is, how are we preparing for these changes at higher learning institutions? What are we going to be doing differently next year when we receive students who have who present their SPM qualifications, where you see a separate document with performance spelled out in English language proficiency in terms of the students' ability in listening, speaking, reading, and writing. I take this opportunity now to briefly talk to you about the reforms which have been taking place in our schools, as it has implications for those of us receiving students at university. Next slide, please. A curriculum has a lifespan for reasons I have explained earlier, right? As I talked about how society evolves and changes, so too does a curriculum need to keep up with such changes. After a number of years, there is a need to ask ourselves how helpful the curriculum content has been in meeting our philosophy of education and the changing demands of society. When I first became a teacher, about in the early 90s, the KBSR and KBSM curriculum in Malaysian primary and secondary schools was just being introduced. It was an exciting time for English language education in Malaysia because the communicative approach to teach English promised to address the declining standard of English that became apparent in Malaysia in the late 80s. So there was a lot of hope, and I'm talking about the early 90s here, to arrest the declining standard of English which was observed in Malaysia. As young teachers, we were trained to incorporate the teaching of listening skills, taking audio recorders, audio record players into classrooms. The literature component began to feature fairly prominently in our schools, and I'm talking about the early 90s here. It was all rather novel, and the aim was to arrest the declining standard of English among our students. However, after more than 2 decades, we found ourselves conceding that English proficiency was still an issue, if not a more serious problem within our education system. We all have strong opinions of why we have failed to ensure that our students are proficient in English. I believe that our classroom activities have been geared towards preparing students for exams for too long. And this has been a major contributing factor. Students are drilled into structuring sentences in a certain way when writing essays and answering questions with formulaic responses. For too long, the teaching of listening and speaking skills have taken a back seat to reading and writing, which are tested through summative assessments. So in a nutshell, we have been teaching to the test, much to the detriment of language learning. I would say that this is also the case with English language proficiency courses at universities. I have had personal experience of having to spend almost half the semester conducting assessments. And I think we fail to focus on teaching and helping students hone their proficiency skills. Next slide, please. So the introduction of the new KSSR and KSSM curricula in our primary and secondary schools, which began about 5 years ago, offers some new hope for the move away from teaching to the test, at least for English. Even if teachers may be struggling with this change, the emphasis on school-based assessments means that teachers now have to assess proficiency based on all 4 skills. The introduction of the CEFR, or Common European Framework of Reference aligned curriculum for English, now sees teachers talking about language performance in more tangible terms, describing what a learner is able to do with language. The hope is that teachers are able to more effectively identify students who need additional practice in certain skills and address those needs immediately so that no student falls too far behind. One of the problems we have observed in the last couple of decades for sure is that students arriving, let's say in secondary school in Form 1, are almost beyond help because they're not able to read, they do not possess sufficient vocabulary to manage the textbooks which are provided in secondary schools. And so teachers find themselves at a loss. And so the hope is that with this new curriculum where language proficiency is spelled out in terms of what a child is able to do, teachers are able to measure performance in more measurable terms. Next slide, please. So, based on the aspirational targets set in the English language education reform in Malaysia, the roadmap, students entering university should be at B1 or B2. The task for us at university is to ensure that students graduate possessing evidence that they are at B1 or C1, depending on the courses they are enrolled in. This year, students sitting for the SPM English paper, as I said just now, will receive a document which provides details of their performance across the 4 skills: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. How are we going to make sure, or rather, how are we going to make use of this information when we receive these students? What implications are there for us? Next slide, please. Allow me to reflect on our current practices and the inherent challenges we face. The first challenge at most higher learning institutions is limited time and limited resources. The implication is that language teachers, English language teachers, face large groups of students, which makes teaching a challenge. Language proficiency classes cannot be treated like content subjects. If you were facing a group of 100 students in a lecture hall, delivering a lecture on specific topics in disciplines such as health science or accounting, you work on certain assumptions. The primary assumption is that the students possess the intellectual capacity to comprehend new knowledge, so long as you explain and engage in discussions. The knowledge you share is most likely new to every student in your lecture. In a language classroom, teachers are tasked with honing communication skills. We are in the business of helping students build their vocabulary range to manage academic texts, which lecturers of other subjects assume that they already possess. This cannot be done when student numbers are large. The question we need to ask is if it is necessary for all students, all those students in that language proficiency class to be there. Are they all at the same level? And if not, are we doing justice by placing students of multiple proficiencies together in the same language classroom? can our resources be better managed with the new information we now have access to? So, for example, if a student enters our university and the student already shows evidence of being at C1, and you have other students who are at A2, should we put these students in the same classroom simply because the students need to earn a certain number of credits as required by as set by MQA requirements, or can we create a system, as Professor Chakravarti pointed out just now, where learners take ownership of their learning and still earn the kind of credits they need for graduation, and at the same time be allowed to take courses which challenge them based on the kind of proficiency they possess at a certain point in time. Next slide, please. In this final part of my presentation, I wish to propose ways in which reforms can take place to improve English language education in higher learning institutions. Next slide, please. Language proficiency classes essentially focus on developing the 4 skills, and the core is a focus on vocabulary building and grammar. The aspirational targets prescribed by the roadmap is that students exiting higher learning institutions need to be at B2 or C1, depending on the demands of their career paths. So it will be up to the faculties to determine whether they want their students graduating at a B2 or a C1 based on advice or discussions with the respective English language departments at their universities. This is good because we get to speak of proficiency in more measurable terms. When we talk about students being, in the past, right, whenever we've seen newspaper reports about lamenting about the proficiency of students, very abstract terms are used that, students are poor in English, are weak in English, and we don't really know what the newspapers or the speakers mean by describing a student as weak or poor. How poor is poor? How weak is weak? So one advantage of drawing on the CEFR framework is that it allows us to speak of proficiency in more tangible terms. I'm not saying that the CEFR is the perfect solution to our problems, because even within the framework, there are abstract terms used there as well, but it certainly provides a sufficient framework for us to talk about performance in more tangible terms. So once faculties set the exit requirements, the language centers should offer courses which take students from the level you have set as entry requirements to reaching the aspirational target and beyond. The focus must be on enhancing proficiency based on knowledge of where students are at the point of entry. If the university decides to accept students who are at A2, for example, then you have quite a task ahead of you in taking the student from A2 to B2. Courses need to be developed to meet the needs of the students so that students feel challenged without feeling overwhelmed. Next slide, please. So this reform process in our approach to English language education at higher learning institutions should not unnecessarily burden English language departments. English language teachers should be able to focus on their core business of helping students improve their proficiency while also developing as academics in higher learning institutions. An advantage of drawing on the CEFR for teaching English is that we become part of a global community of ELT practitioners, speaking a common language. So when a teacher in Malaysia describes her students as being at B1, this is something that a teacher in Brazil would understand, because B1 is a universal term that is universally understood. Next slide, please. For decades now, English language teaching material as well as assessments have been developed to support learning across the globe. Malaysian higher learning institutions should take advantage of this rather than trying to reinvent the wheel and have our language instructors develop material from scratch and build new tests. In fact, if the reform is done properly, I hope that the professional development opportunities for academics in English language departments can be greater and benefit the university. So if the tools are out there, you have internationally distributed textbooks, you have support material which is pitched at the various levels across the CFR levels, and you have assessments which are aligned online and accessible, then this is going to take the burden off English language departments. And taking that burden off the English language departments means that the English language lecturers, the teachers at the respective departments now have room to develop as academics, to get involved in research, to publish. Because in a lot of English language departments, the complaint is that they have too many hours of teaching and they're not able to manage anything beyond teaching. And this needs to change in our universities. The reforms can ease the burden of those teaching proficiency courses while ensuring that students leave university with evidence of having achieved the aspirational targets. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I have come to the end of my presentation, and I am happy to take questions to further this discussion if there is time.
Thank you, Associate Professor Dr. Ramesh Nair, for your interesting speech. I would like to invite Madam Mashita to present a certificate as a token of appreciation to Associate Professor Dr. Ramesh Nair.
Thank you, Amrit. Thanks, Associate Professor. It's such a very enlightening session. In that perspective, in the recommendations given, it's something that faculty need to take a look in order to cater the needs of the students. So on behalf of the committee, this certificate is to appreciate Associate Professor on his contribution to this session as a plenary speaker. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Dr. Ramesh Nair, since you are still here, okay, we have a few questions. Would it be okay if you can answer them?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Okay, so we have a question from Mr. Chiu Wei Yun. My question is the rigid structure of the English subject hampering the interest in English? Would it be better if we focus on the interest rather than the usage of the English?
Right. Thank you for that question. When you talk about the rigid structure, I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to, but I would say that the rigidity does hamper effective teaching and learning. So as I talked about, what I hope will happen in higher learning institutions is that we match the language courses with the proficiency level of where the students are at. So as I said, you are receiving students who may be at different levels when it comes to their proficiency. And the best way of describing proficiency that we have now with the change in the curriculum is the CFR aligned levels. So it would not be fair to put a student who is at C1 with a student who is at B1 in terms of proficiency within the same language classroom. that is where you're going to have half the students who are bored because it doesn't challenge them enough. And then you're going to have students who may be at A2 who are struggling to keep up with your lessons because they don't possess the vocabulary range to manage the text that you are presenting to them. And so this is what we want to free ourselves from. So what universities can do is to create a system. Now you're going to receive students, let's say after SPM, and the SPM certificate tells you that student A is at B1 or above. You have some students who are at A2. So what the universities should ideally offer are courses taking students from A1 to B1, from B1 to B2, right? And if the faculty decides that B2 is the exit level, then you have a very specific goal, right? And when you design these courses, like I said just now, let's not reinvent the wheel. Let's draw on existing material which is already CEFR aligned, which is out there. If you remember, and sorry if I'm taking a little too long to answer this question, in secondary schools and Malaysian primary schools a few years ago, when the reforms took place, internationally aligned textbooks were introduced in the schools, if you remember that. And there was, a whole lot of narratives taking place when the books were introduced, saying, "Oh, we're losing our culture, and we've lost our Malaysianness in our teaching because we're drawing on the books." The ministry drew on these books for a reason. These books were already aligned and pitched at various levels of performance, right? In terms of vocabulary, it was controlled. In terms of the length of text, they were all controlled. The only thing missing was the Malaysianness of the content. And this is something that as English language teachers, we know we can do this. We know how to bring in local culture, local elements into our books. But when these books are pitched at the right level, then they are being, you receive a student at A1 and you're taking the student from A1 to B1. The book then serves that purpose. And as English language teachers, we can confidently use that material. What's happening at the universities now, and again, like I said, it's not fair of me to paint this with a very broad brush, but lecturers are expected to get material, from the internet and to adapt material and things like that, and that takes up a lot of time. But with all that effort, you don't even know whether the material that you're selecting is pitched at the right level for the students. So we tend to be, I think we find ourselves creating extra work for ourselves and then still not doing as good a job as we can. So back to the question, should we focus on interest? Yes, the material must be engaging. It must be of interest to the students. But we're talking about the use of English as well. Remember, the aspirations of the CFR is that it describes language performance in terms of what a student can do with a language. So we're going to be talking about performance in more measurable and tangible terms. And so I think, Wei Yun, I suppose the best way to answer that is we need to address both interest as well as usage. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Ramesh. I agree with you that as a teacher, we don't just teach, right? We look at their interests and we make sure they learn something at the end of the day. That is the main goal of teaching. We have another question from Miss Aimi Farina. She said, learning a language can be a burdening task for some students. In your point of view, how can we as teachers ensure that the students are receiving the best and at the same time enjoying the language learning process?
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. It's a difficult question to answer, but I would say that learning has to be purposeful. Students must know the goals and the ends of any kind of learning. And if a student is sitting in your class for 14 weeks in a semester, and at the end of the 14 weeks has just done it simply because the university requires the student to attend that class and to earn a grade, then it's a wasted opportunity. right? I think as teachers, we want to ensure that students, as Aimee points out, enjoys the learning process and sees the purpose of language learning. So, when we talk about English language teaching in higher learning institutions, I think personally, we're talking about proficiency. And we're talking about the needs of academic English. What happens in your language class affects the performance of students in all the other subjects, because I'm talking about institutions where English is the medium of instruction. How a student is able to perform in content subjects like in health science, writing assignments and all that is dependent on how the student, how proficient the student is in the language, to manage reading critically, to be able to bring ideas together and write a term paper. All this requires language skills. So that link must be there. But what we need to keep in mind is that students need to be approximately at a B2 to manage academic English. Right now, we're not looking at all this, right? We receive the students, we assume they're all at about the same level, we give them an academic English course, and we move them along. We award them a grade and they move along. But how many of the students have been able to digest and manage the kind of content that we have delivered, right? And so for that student, if I'm a student who is at A2 and I am sitting in an academic English class, I am being burdened. We are burdening the student because the student is not ready to manage the content of that course. And so what we need to do now is to make informed decisions. As faculties, decide on what kind of grade, CFR grade, you are willing to accept students at. If you are accepting students at A2 right now, within the Malaysian education system, A2 puts a student in lower secondary, upper primary, lower secondary is at A2. So if we are taking students in at university who are at A2, we need to keep that in mind, right? So you need to take the students from where they are to where they need to get. So based on the aspirational targets which have been set, in the roadmap, all faculties, well, I think almost all faculties, this is open for discussion, I suppose, at the University Senate. You need to ensure that the students graduate at B2 or C1. So if you have students doing medicine, obviously as doctors, there's a lot of human interaction, and you may demand that these students graduate at C1. But if you're offering courses like, in Islamic studies, let's say, you may feel that, your students will not need as much English in the real world as the average person. So you may decide, all right, these students, we're happy to see these students exit at B1. This then informs the language departments about what kind of courses you need to design and where you need to pitch that. And so you see students, taking tracks. And as, again, I draw on what Professor Chakravarti pointed out just now about having students take ownership of their learning. Learning cannot just take place during, the language classroom. Independent learning. I mean, if you're talking about honing your listening skills, you don't have to do that in a language classroom. You just need to, sit down and watch and watch a movie, for example, without the subtitles, things like that. I'm sorry, I'm taking too long. Thank you.
Dr. Ramesh, I agree with you. Like you said that a lot of universities need to refine the courses, especially intensive English courses, so that they get from where they are to what they are supposed to be at, the level that they're supposed to be at. Okay, so Miss Aimee Farina, okay, let's end that. Okay, which means if the students come in with an A2, they cannot be extended to join the uni program after just 2 months. They have to study until they reach B2 proficiency. B2 is the requirement for most universities. Yes, okay, that is correct. Okay, and then we have one final question. Do we have time for that, I guess? Okay, so it comes from Siti Azwani. As we all know, English was used as a medium of delivery for all teaching and learning in higher education. In your opinion, should we begin implementing English as a medium of delivery in teaching and learning as early as primary school?
All right. Well, this is national policy. I mean, I think we're not going to see this happen, right? There have been discussions about giving Malaysians a choice, right? Where some schools have English as the medium of instruction, whereas other schools have Malay as a medium of instruction. We've come now, I think, 4 or 5 decades now since we had that system where English was our medium of instruction in our schools. As someone who went through school where Malay was the medium of instruction, I know that I am not as proficient as maybe my parents were, because they went through an education system where English was the medium of instruction. I don't think we need to choose English as the medium of instruction simply because we want to see our students become proficient in English. Sure, language is about use. The more you use the language, the more proficient you become, right? It's not like rocket science, right? It's about use and practice. I think one of the blessings we have in this country is that we have so many languages. And I think that's something we need to celebrate rather than worry about. The fact that, I may be Malay and going to a Chinese school, a primary school, a Chinese medium school, and I'm acquiring Mandarin at school, I'm acquiring Malay at home, and I'm learning English during my English lessons. That's amazing. That's fantastic. So let's celebrate, being polyglots and being able to speak many languages. But given the reality of our situation, certainly more needs to be done to help our students become proficient in English, because our world is such that English is a very important tool, for us in the real world.
I agree with you, Dr. Ramesh. I feel that at the end of the day, students should be the one benefiting from all the languages that we have in our country.
Yeah.
I think that's the beauty of our country. We are exposed to many different languages, and they should be the one, mastering the language at the end of the day, and they do not develop language anxiety instead. Okay, and
Yes.
there is another one, okay, from Wei as well. Just a fun question. Should we make our very own Manglish, Malaysian style English, an official version of English?
Okay, so it depends how far language serves a purpose, and we make use of Manglish in the right context, and it works well for us. In fact, it works better. I mean, if I was to speak the way I'm speaking to you now, if I were to go to a coffee shop, I think I'd sound really odd, right? So I think we have this ability to choose the right registers depending on the situation
the right slang.
we find ourselves. Maybe Manglish may not be the term, but one of the things I've kind of found is that, like I said just now, when we use these internationally distributed textbooks and there are listening activities, and you have a native speaker speaking English, it often throws not just the student, but also the teacher, in the fact that, this accent, and immediately teachers also almost without thinking say, this accent is difficult. It's not that it's difficult, it's just because it's different.
They are not familiar with it.
Right. So we're talking about being internationally intelligible, right? So if I speak with my Malaysian accent, and if I am intelligible, I make apologies to no one, right? Because it is not, the CFR or any other approach you take to language learning does not say that you need to emulate a certain model, right? You want to be able to communicate so that you are internationally intelligible.
Yes.
And so
at the
long as
end of
that
the day,
is-
the goal is communication. Yes.
right. Yeah.
Okay, so I guess that's all our questions for today. Okay, so that was a great Q&A session. Thank you, Dr. Ramesh Nair. Okay, before we go for our short tea break, I would like to mention that our session after the tea break will be continued in Microsoft Teams.